If you're here, you're probably fascinated by the hidden economies that shape our world, the underground markets, the shadow empires, the substances that built fortunes and destroyed nations. This is one of those stories, and it starts in a place you might not expect. This story begins with a sacred leaf in the Andes Mountains, transforms into a miracle medicine celebrated by European doctors, and ends with billion-dollar empires, mass graves, and white powder on nightclub tables across the world. This isn't just a story about drugs or crime. This is about how prohibition creates markets, how those markets become more powerful than governments, and how a plant that indigenous people used for thousands of years became the backbone of criminal organizations that reshaped entire countries. If this is the kind of deep dive you're here for, stick around. And if you find value in understanding these hidden systems, subscribing helps me keep exploring the dark economies that run beneath our everyday world. Now let's talk about cocaine, how a sacred leaf became white gold, and how that transformation changed everything. This is the story of narco empires. The line on the table didn't start here. It didn't start in the nightclub bathroom in New York or London or Madrid, where someone's about to lean down with a rolled bill. It didn't start in the luxury apartment or the corporate office or the college dorm. That white powder has a journey behind it that connects some of the poorest farmers in the world to some of the richest criminals, that links remote jungle laboratories to sophisticated money laundering operations in global financial centers, that ties together violence in Colombia and Mexico with demand in North America and Europe in ways that shape politics, economics, and daily life for millions of people who never touch the drug itself. Let's start with the scale of what we're talking about, because the numbers from 2023 are staggering in ways that should make anyone pay attention. Global cocaine production hit record highs at over 3,700 tons. That's not a typo. 3,700 tons of refined cocaine produced in a single year. There are approximately 25 million users worldwide, and that number has been climbing steadily over the past decade, up from around 17 million just 10 years earlier. The major markets are North America, Western and Central Europe, and increasingly South America itself, where local consumption is growing as production centers expand. But those aggregate numbers, as massive as they are, don't really capture what the cocaine trade actually looks like on the ground, how the system functions, who profits and who suffers. So let me paint you a different picture by following the journey of that white powder from beginning to end, because understanding how cocaine moves through the world tells you everything about why this market is so durable and so deadly. It starts with a farmer in the Andes, maybe in Colombia, which produces about 2/3 of the world's coca, or maybe in Peru or Bolivia, where cultivation continues despite decades of eradication efforts. This farmer is growing coca plants, not because he particularly wants to be part of a criminal enterprise, but because coca pays better than any legal crop he could plant, because armed groups or traffickers control his region and sometimes force cultivation, because there's no viable legal economy in his remote mountain community that offers anything close to the same income. He harvests the leaves, sells them to someone who processes them into coca paste, and receives a tiny fraction of what that product will eventually be worth by the time it reaches consumer markets. The paste moves to jungle laboratories, hidden facilities deep in remote areas, where chemists refine it into cocaine hydrochloride, the white powder that can be shipped and sold. These labs can be sophisticated operations with trained chemists and proper equipment, or they can be crude jungle facilities that produce lower quality product, but operate at such volume that quality doesn't matter much. The cocaine is packaged for transport, usually in kilogram blocks, wrapped in plastic and tape, ready to begin the most dangerous and most profitable part of the journey. From the labs, the cocaine travels along routes that have been refined over decades to avoid law enforcement. It might move by small aircraft to clandestine airstrips, by speedboat along rivers and coastlines, by submarine, yes, actual submarines built by trafficking organizations specifically for smuggling, some of them remarkably sophisticated, or increasingly by commercial shipping containers mixed in with legitimate cargo, where customs inspectors trying to find drugs are basically searching for needles in acres of haystacks. The cocaine moves through Central America, often passing through weak states where corruption and violence have hollowed out government authority, and into Mexico, where the cartels that control the U.S. border crossings take over the final and most lucrative stage of the journey. Getting cocaine across the U.S. border or into European ports requires enormous infrastructure, networks of drivers, safe houses, corrupt officials, money couriers, communication specialists, enforcers to handle problems, and layers of insulation so that if one part of the operation gets arrested, the rest can continue functioning. Once the cocaine is inside consumer countries, it moves through distribution networks that break down bulk shipments into smaller amounts, cutting the pure product with various additives to increase volume and profit margins, until eventually it reaches street-level dealers who sell to individual users. And then someone at a nightclub or a party or alone in their apartment uses that cocaine, and the money flows backward through the entire chain. That money, estimated at tens of billions of dollars annually globally, moves back through the distribution networks, back to the Mexican cartels who control the border crossing routes, back to the Colombian organizations who control production, and tiny fractions of it eventually reach those Andean farmers who started the whole process. Most of the money stays in the middle, in the hands of the organizations who handle transport, distribution, and most crucially, who manage the violence and corruption that make the whole system possible. This is the system that exists right now, today, operating at record levels despite decades of law enforcement efforts and billions spent on the war on drugs. But here's what makes this story fascinating. It wasn't always like this. Cocaine wasn't always illegal, wasn't always associated with cartels and violence. There was a time when cocaine was perfectly legal, when respectable doctors prescribed it, when major corporations used it in their products, when it was seen as a miracle drug rather than a dangerous narcotic. To understand how we got from there to here, we need to go back to the beginning, back thousands of years before anyone ever heard of Pablo Escobar or the war on drugs. We need to go back to the Andes, where this story really starts. High in the Andes Mountains, long before Europeans arrived in South America, long before anyone knew how to extract pure alkaloids from plant material, indigenous communities discovered something remarkable about a plant that grew in their harsh environment. The coca plant, with its small green leaves, had properties that helped with the brutal challenges of living and working at extreme altitudes. When you chewed the leaves, mixing them with lime or ash to activate the compounds, you felt less hungry, less tired, more able to handle the thin air and the cold and the endless physical labor that mountain life demanded. Archaeological evidence shows that coca use in the Andes goes back thousands of years. Researchers have found traces of cocaine in ancient mummies and burial sites, showing that this wasn't just a practical tool, but something woven deeply into religious rituals and cultural practices. For these communities, coca was sacred, a gift from the gods that made life possible in an impossible environment. It was medicine, it was ritual, it was economy. Farmers would chew coca leaves while working their fields, getting through 12-hour days of back-breaking labor at altitudes where every breath is difficult. When the Spanish arrived and began their colonial conquest of South America, they initially viewed coca with suspicion as a pagan practice that needed to be suppressed, but they quickly recognized its utility. If forcing indigenous people to work in silver mines and on plantations was going to be profitable, and those people needed coca to survive that labor, then coca would be tolerated and even encouraged. The Spanish began taxing coca production and trade, turning a sacred indigenous practice into a colonial revenue stream. But during all of this period, coca remained just that, a leaf you chewed. Nobody had isolated the active compound. Nobody knew that coca contained an alkaloid that could be extracted and concentrated and turned into something far more powerful and far more dangerous than the traditional leaf. That changes in the 19th century when European chemistry advances to the point where scientists can isolate active compounds from plants. In the 1850s and 1860s, researchers managed to extract pure cocaine from coca leaves, and what they discover excites the medical community enormously. Cocaine is a powerful local anesthetic. Apply it to tissue, and that tissue goes numb, which is revolutionary for surgery and dentistry. It's also a stimulant that seems to increase energy and focus and alleviate fatigue. Medical papers begin describing cocaine as a wonder drug with enormous therapeutic potential. One of the most famous early enthusiasts is Sigmund Freud, who in the 1880s writes several papers praising cocaine's effects. He uses it himself, recommends it to friends and patients, describes it as a magical substance that can treat depression, digestive problems, morphine addiction, and various other conditions. Freud is brilliant, but he's also spectacularly wrong about cocaine's safety. He'll later realize the drug is highly addictive and can cause serious psychiatric problems, and he'll quietly distance himself from his earlier enthusiasm. But the damage is done in terms of promoting cocaine as something benign and beneficial. Pharmaceutical companies begin producing cocaine-based medicines and tonics. It's added to wines marketed as health tonics. It shows up in various patent medicines sold over the counter. And most famously, when a pharmacist in Atlanta named John Pemberton creates a new soft drink in 1886, he includes coca leaf extract as one of the ingredients. That drink is Coca-Cola, and while the company will later remove the cocaine and then even the coca leaf entirely from the formula, the name remains as a reminder of the drug's origins in respectable commercial products. This is the crucial context to understand. Cocaine wasn't always what it is today. There was a period when it was perfectly legal, when respectable doctors and companies used it openly, when there was a legitimate market and legitimate production. The question we need to answer is how we got from that world to the world of cartels and smuggling and violence. And the answer, like so many things about drug policy, is that prohibition created the very problems it was supposed to solve. When the legal door closed, the illegal door opened wide, and the people who walked through it built empires. By the early 20th century, the miracle drug narrative around cocaine is starting to crack as evidence accumulates that maybe this substance isn't as benign as everyone thought. Doctors are seeing patients who've become dependent on cocaine-containing medicines, who need ever-increasing doses, who experience terrible psychiatric symptoms, including paranoia and hallucinations when they use too much. Stories emerge of people whose lives have been destroyed by cocaine addiction, and the medical community that once praised the drug begins to recognize they've made a serious mistake. This growing awareness of cocaine's dangers coincides with broader social movements around drugs and alcohol that are gaining momentum in the United States and Europe. The temperance movement is pushing for alcohol prohibition. Moral reformers are increasingly concerned about opium and other narcotics. There's a growing sentiment that the government should regulate or ban substances that are seen as harmful to public health and morality, even if people want to use them voluntarily. International drug control treaties begin establishing frameworks for restricting cocaine along with opiates. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 in the United States effectively makes non-medical use of cocaine illegal. Other countries pass similar laws. Pharmaceutical companies stop adding cocaine to their products. Coca-Cola changes its formula. Within a remarkably short period, cocaine goes from being a legal, widely used substance to being criminalized and pushed underground. But here's the thing about prohibition that policymakers consistently fail to understand or refuse to acknowledge. Making something illegal doesn't make demand for it disappear. It just means that demand will be met by illegal suppliers rather than legal ones. And illegal suppliers operating outside the law anyway have no incentive to behave responsibly, no quality controls, no accountability, and enormous profit margins that make the risks worthwhile. Legal cocaine was cheap to produce and generated modest profits for pharmaceutical companies. Illegal cocaine becomes wildly expensive because of the legal risks involved in producing and distributing it, which means profit margins explode for anyone willing to take those risks. The farmers growing coca still make very little money because they have no leverage and no alternatives. But the people who handle transport, who bribe officials, who take the risk of smuggling across borders and selling in foreign markets, they can make fortunes that dwarf anything available in the legal economy. For several decades after Prohibition, cocaine remains somewhat niche in the United States, overshadowed by heroin and marijuana in the illegal drug market. But by the 1960s, and especially the 1970s, something changes. Cocaine starts being marketed, implicitly and explicitly, as a glamour drug, a safe drug, a drug for wealthy, sophisticated people, rather than desperate addicts. It's portrayed as non-addictive, as a cleaner high than heroin, as something you can use recreationally without destroying your life. These claims are completely false, but they're effective marketing, and demand begins growing rapidly among middle and upper-class users in the United States and Europe. This growing demand creates an enormous business opportunity for anyone positioned to supply it, and several factors make Colombia the ideal place for a cocaine industry to develop. Colombia has remote areas with coca cultivation. It has a tradition of smuggling going back to the colonial period. It has weak government control over large portions of its territory, and it has proximity to both the coca-growing regions of Peru and Bolivia and the major consumer markets in North America. What Colombia needs is organization, someone to build the infrastructure, to transform coca paste into refined cocaine and move it efficiently to market. Enter a collection of ambitious criminals who see the opportunity and have the ruthlessness to seize it. In the 1970s, various smuggling operations begin to consolidate and professionalize. They're learning from each other's successes and failures, building relationships with suppliers and distributors, investing in better equipment and more sophisticated methods. And in Medellín, Colombia's second-largest city, several men are building what will become the first true cocaine empire, an organization so powerful and so violent that it will challenge the Colombian state itself and flood American cities with cocaine on an unprecedented scale. The Medellín cartel is about to transform the cocaine trade from a profitable criminal business into something that looks like a parallel state, and the consequences will reshape Colombia, the United States, and the entire drug war for decades. The name Pablo Escobar has become so mythologized, so wrapped in legends and television dramatizations, that it's easy to lose sight of what he and his organization actually built, and what it meant for Colombia and for the global cocaine trade. But to understand the modern drug war, to understand how narco empires function, you need to understand the Medellín cartel in the 1970s and 1980s, because they essentially wrote the playbook that every major trafficking organization since has followed, adapted, or tried to improve upon. Escobar didn't start the cocaine trade. He started as a small-time criminal in Medellín, doing car theft and smuggling various contraband. But he recognized earlier than most people the enormous opportunity that cocaine represented. In the mid-1970s, he begins working with other criminals and entrepreneurs who are all seeing the same thing. American demand for cocaine is exploding, prices are incredibly high, and anyone who can organize reliable supply chains will make extraordinary amounts of money. Escobar partners with the Ochoa brothers, who come from a legitimate business family and bring organizational skills and social connections. Jorge Luis Ochoa, Fabio Ochoa, and their brother Juan David become crucial partners. Carlos later brings aviation expertise and access to Caribbean islands that can serve as transshipment points. Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, brings muscle and ruthlessness. Together, these men and others build something unprecedented: an industrial-scale cocaine production and distribution operation that will at its peak control an estimated 80% of the cocaine flowing into the United States. Let me walk you through how the system works at its height in the early 1980s, because understanding the logistics helps explain both why it was so successful and why it was so violent. The operation starts with sourcing coca paste from Peru and Bolivia, where coca cultivation is extensive, but refining facilities are less developed. The Medellín organization either buys the paste from local producers or sometimes controls the production directly through partnerships with local traffickers. The paste is transported to Colombia, often by small aircraft, flying at night below radar coverage, landing on clandestine airstrips in remote areas. In Colombia, the paste goes to jungle laboratories where it's refined into cocaine hydrochloride using chemicals that are relatively easy to obtain: ether, acetone, hydrochloric acid. These labs can be sophisticated operations with trained chemists producing very pure product, or they can be crude facilities making adequate cocaine at high volume. The Medellín cartel operates multiple labs, spreading out production to reduce the risk of losing everything if one facility gets raided. Once the cocaine is refined, it needs to get to the United States, And this is where the operation's sophistication really shows. They're using multiple routes to avoid putting all their product on any single pathway that law enforcement might disrupt. Cocaine flies on small aircraft to Caribbean islands and Central America. It travels by speedboat along Colombia's extensive coastline. It's hidden in legitimate cargo shipments passing through commercial ports. Carlos Leder, at one point, essentially buys Norman's Cay in the Bahamas and turns it into a transshipment hub where planes can land and refuel before continuing to Florida. In Florida, which in the late 1970s and early 1980s becomes the main entry point for Colombian cocaine, the Medellín organization has established distribution networks that break down bulk shipments and move the product to cities across the United States. Miami transforms from a sleepy southern city into a cocaine capital where enormous amounts of money are flowing through the economy in ways that are obvious to anyone paying attention. Luxury car dealerships doing record business, real estate prices soaring, banks overwhelmed with cash deposits. The money coming back from the United States is almost harder to manage than the cocaine going north because there's so much of it and it's in cash. At the peak of Medellín's power, they're earning billions of dollars per year, and a significant amount of that is literally in cash. Piles of bills that need to be counted, transported, hidden, and eventually laundered into legitimate assets. Escobar supposedly once wrote off $2 billion in cash that was buried and destroyed by water damage and rats because he simply had too much money to keep track of it all. But with this enormous success comes enormous problems. And this is where the Medellín cartel's approach becomes catastrophically violent in ways that will ultimately lead to their destruction. Escobar and his partners decide early on that violence is the best way to handle obstacles. Police who won't take bribes get assassinated. Journalists who investigate the cartel get killed. Politicians who push for extradition treaties with the United States become targets. The phrase plata o plomo, silver or lead, meaning take a bribe or take a bullet, becomes associated with their approach to anyone who might cause problems. The violence escalates throughout the 1980s in ways that shock even a country familiar with violent crime. Judges are assassinated. Presidential candidates are killed. A commercial airliner is blown up mid-flight in an attempt to kill one politician who wasn't even on the plane. Car bombs explode in Bogota, targeting government buildings. The Medellín cartel at its peak is essentially waging a terrorist campaign against the Colombian state, trying to force the government to abandon extradition treaties and stop cooperating with the United States on drug enforcement. This creates a situation that historians and political scientists call a narco-state. When a criminal organization becomes so powerful and so rich that it can challenge government authority directly, when it controls territory, when it provides services and employment to communities that the government has abandoned, when politicians and police and military officers are on the cartel payroll. In parts of Colombia, during the 1980s, the Medellín cartel arguably has more real power than the government itself, and Escobar becomes a Robin Hood figure to some poor communities in Medellín where he's building housing and soccer fields and buying popularity. But this strategy of confronting the state directly, of using extreme violence to achieve political goals, is ultimately what destroys the Medellín cartel. The Colombian government, under enormous pressure from the United States and facing internal legitimacy crisis, eventually decides they have no choice but to go after Escobar and his organization with everything they have. And at the same time, a rival trafficking organization is watching the Medellín cartel's approach and deciding there's a better way to be a drug lord. Quieter, more corrupting, more businesslike. The Cali cartel is about to show that you can make just as much money as Medellín without becoming public enemy number one. While Pablo Escobar is waging war against the Colombian state and making himself the most famous criminal in the world, a different group of traffickers in the city of Cali, about 250 miles south of Medellín, is building an organization based on a fundamentally different philosophy. The Cali cartel, led primarily by the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, and their partner Pacho Herrera, looks at Medellín's violence and spectacle and decides that's exactly the wrong approach. They position themselves as businessmen, as gentlemen, as respectable citizens who just happen to be running a massive cocaine trafficking operation. The contrast in styles is striking and deliberate. Where Escobar lives in a lavish estate but is constantly moving to avoid capture, the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers live openly in Cali and present themselves as legitimate businessmen with interests in drugstore chains and radio stations. Where Medellín uses car bombs and assassinations, Cali prefers bribes and corruption, buying off police and politicians rather than killing them. Where Escobar cultivates a Robin Hood image with the poor, Cali builds relationships with Colombia's elite and positions themselves as part of respectable society. This isn't because the Cali cartel is less criminal or less ruthless. They're still running a massive drug trafficking operation that destroys lives and corrupts governments. But their approach to managing risk and opposition is more sophisticated. They're investing heavily in intelligence operations, building files on judges and police and politicians so they know exactly who to bribe and how much to offer. They're using legitimate businesses as fronts and money laundering operations, integrating their wealth into the legal economy in ways that make it hard to distinguish drug money from legitimate profits. They're spreading their investments across multiple countries, particularly in real estate and financial assets that can be held offshore. And crucially, they're cooperating with law enforcement against Medellín. The Cali cartel sees that the Colombian government and the United States are utterly focused on capturing or killing Pablo Escobar, and they're quietly providing intelligence that helps that effort. They calculate, correctly, that law enforcement has limited resources and will focus on the most visible, most violent threat, which means as long as Medellín is drawing all the attention, Cali can operate more freely. The strategy works brilliantly. By the early 1990s, as Medellín is being systematically dismantled by a Colombian special operations unit called the Search Block, working with American intelligence and support, the Cali cartel is expanding aggressively. They're taking over routes and markets that Medellín controlled. They're refining their European operations, which Medellín had largely neglected. And at their peak, Cali is estimated to control approximately 80% of the world's cocaine market, with particularly strong dominance in Europe. Think about what that means. A single criminal organization based in one Colombian city is supplying most of the cocaine consumed across the entire planet. The amount of money flowing through their operation is staggering, billions of dollars annually. And they're sophisticated enough in their money laundering that much of it successfully integrates into legitimate financial systems. Banks in multiple countries are handling Cali cartel money, often without knowing it, or sometimes while deliberately looking the other way, because the fees and deposits are too lucrative to refuse. December 2nd, 1993. Pablo Escobar is killed in Medellín during a shootout with Colombian police. He's been on the run for over a year. His organization has been largely dismantled, and his death marks the end of the Medellín cartel as a significant force in the cocaine trade. The Cali cartel has won. They've outlasted their rivals. They control the market. They should be unstoppable, but they've made a critical miscalculation. By becoming so dominant, by controlling such a large percentage of the global cocaine market, they've become impossible to ignore even with their lower profile approach. The United States and Colombia, having successfully destroyed Medellín, now turn their full attention to Cali. And the intelligence operations that the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers built to protect themselves become their vulnerability, because once law enforcement penetrates those networks, the entire organization is exposed. 1995 to 1996. In a series of raids and arrests, the Colombian police dismantled the Cali cartel's leadership. Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela is arrested in June 1995. His brother Miguel is captured in August. Other key leaders fall throughout 1995 and 1996. Unlike Medellín's violent end, Cali's collapse is almost bureaucratic. Arrests, trials, imprisonment. The gentlemen of Cali are going to prison. And just like after Medellín's fall, there's a moment when people think maybe this is it. Maybe destroying both of Colombia's giant cartels means the cocaine trade will diminish significantly. But that's not how black markets work. Demand hasn't decreased. The infrastructure for production and transportation still exists. The expertise is still there. What happens instead is fragmentation and adaptation. Smaller Colombian trafficking groups emerge to fill the vacuum. Organizations that learned from both Medellín's and Cali's mistakes. Groups that stay smaller and more decentralized to avoid becoming single large targets. Guerrilla organizations like the FARC and paramilitaries like the AUC that had previously just taxed the cocaine trade start getting directly involved in production and trafficking because the money is too enormous to pass up. And most significantly, the balance of power in the cocaine trade begins shifting away from Colombia entirely and toward the organizations that control something even more valuable than production capacity, the routes into the United States. The Mexican cartels, which had been important partners for Colombian organizations, but junior partners subordinate to the Colombians who controlled production, suddenly realize they're in the driver's seat. Colombia can produce as much cocaine as it wants, but if you can't get it across the US-Mexico border, it's worthless. And the organizations that control those border crossings are about to become the most powerful criminal enterprises in the Western Hemisphere. The story of how Mexican cartels rose to dominance in the cocaine trade is really the story of geography, economics, and the unintended consequences of law enforcement success against Colombian organizations. In the 1970s and 1980s, when Medellín and Cali were at their peak, Mexican trafficking groups were important but secondary players in the cocaine business. They were contractors, essentially. The Colombians would pay them to move cocaine across the border into the United States. But the Colombians maintained control over the product, owned it until it was delivered to distributors in American cities, and kept most of the profits. But as American law enforcement gets better at interdicting Caribbean and Florida routes in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the cocaine trade shifts geographically. The Caribbean islands and direct flights to Florida become too risky, too heavily monitored. The logical alternative is to move cocaine by land through Central America and Mexico, which means Mexican organizations that control the border crossing routes suddenly become absolutely essential. And as the Colombian cartels weaken and fragment through the 1990s following the fall of Medellín and Cali, the Mexicans negotiate better and better deals until eventually they're not just transporters but buyers, purchasing cocaine from Colombians and then selling it themselves in the United States at enormous markup. Several Mexican organizations evolve from regional smuggling operations into powerful transnational cartels, but a few dominate the story. The Guadalajara cartel in the 1980s, led by Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, is really the first major Mexican cocaine trafficking organization, building relationships with the Colombians and establishing control over key border roads. When Gallardo is arrested in 1989, his organization fragments into multiple successor groups that will become the major Mexican cartels: Sinaloa, Tijuana, Juarez, and others. The Sinaloa cartel, which emerges from this fragmentation and eventually becomes the most powerful Mexican trafficking organization, shows how the business model evolves. Under leaders like Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, Sinaloa doesn't just move cocaine. They diversify into methamphetamine production, heroin, marijuana, and synthetic opioids. They build sophisticated tunnels under the border, use submarines and semi-submersibles, corrupt officials at every level from local police to federal agents, and establish distribution networks deep into the United States. But Sinaloa isn't alone. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known as CJNG, emerges in the late 2000s and rapidly becomes one of the most violent and aggressive organizations, challenging Sinaloa for dominance and establishing itself as a major international trafficking operation. The Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas, the Juarez Cartel. At various times, each of these organizations controls significant portions of the cocaine trade and the territories needed to move drugs north. What makes Mexican cartels different from their Colombian predecessors? What makes them particularly dangerous and particularly difficult to combat? Is that they're not just drug trafficking organizations. They've diversified into almost every form of criminal enterprise you can imagine. Yes, they move enormous amounts of cocaine, but they're also producing methamphetamine and fentanyl in industrial quantities. They're running human smuggling operations, charging migrants thousands of dollars to guide them across the border. They're engaged in extortion and kidnapping. They're stealing fuel from pipelines and selling it illegally. They're involved in illegal mining, illegal logging, avocado extortion. They've essentially become diversified criminal conglomerates that generate revenue from multiple sources, which makes them more resilient than organizations that depend entirely on one product. The violence associated with Mexican cartels is extreme in ways that sometimes shock even people familiar with organized crime. The death toll from cartel-related violence in Mexico over the past 2 decades numbers in the hundreds of thousands. Entire police forces have been killed or corrupted. Journalists who investigate cartel activities are murdered regularly. Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. Mass graves are discovered containing dozens or hundreds of bodies. People disappear and are never found. The brutality is sometimes gratuitous, designed to terrorize rivals and authorities and civilians into submission. But here's what's crucial to understand. This violence isn't random or senseless from the cartel's perspective. It's a business strategy, a form of enforcement and deterrence in a market where they can't sue in court or call police when contracts are violated. If a distributor steals your money or your product, You can't take them to court, so you torture and kill them and make sure everyone knows about it, so others don't get similar ideas. If a rival organization is moving into your territory, you can't file a complaint with the authorities. So you kill their members and anyone associated with them until they retreat or you've eliminated them entirely. The Mexican government's attempts to combat the cartels have created a security situation that sometimes resembles low-intensity civil war. Military deployments to cartel-controlled regions lead to battles with well-armed traffickers who sometimes have better equipment than the soldiers. Police corruption is so endemic that entire units are sometimes found to be working for cartels. Politicians and officials who can't be bribed are killed, and American demand for drugs continues unabated, ensuring that no matter how much cocaine gets seized, no matter how many cartel members get arrested or killed, there's always someone willing to step in and supply the market because the profit margins are too enormous to resist. By 2024, the route for most cocaine reaching the United States looks like this. Produced in Colombia, from coca grown primarily in Colombia, with some from Peru and Bolivia, transported north through Central America, with significant waypoints in countries like Guatemala and Honduras, where weak governance makes interdiction difficult, then moved across Mexico by cartels controlling specific territories and border crossing points, and finally smuggled into the United States through tunnels, in vehicles with hidden compartments, in commercial trucks mixed with legitimate cargo, by boat to California, by small aircraft to remote areas. Every method you can imagine, because traffickers adapt faster than law enforcement can close off routes. And the profits from this system. They've made Mexican cartel leaders some of the wealthiest criminals in world history. Before his arrest, El Chapo was estimated to have a personal fortune in the billions. The organizations generate tens of billions of dollars in revenue annually. And that money corrupts everything it touches: police, military, politicians, banks, legitimate businesses that knowingly or unknowingly launder drug proceeds. The cartels have become so wealthy and so powerful that they are essentially parallel states in the regions they control, providing employment, enforcing order, and governing more effectively than the actual government in some areas. This is the modern cocaine trade, industrialized, globalized, more sophisticated, and more violent than ever before, generating profits that dwarf the Colombian cartels of the 1980s, and seemingly immune to every enforcement strategy that's been tried against it. But to really understand why this system is so durable, we need to stop thinking about cartels as criminal organizations and start thinking about them as what they actually are: sophisticated multinational corporations that just happen to operate in illegal markets. If you strip away the violence and the illegality for a moment and just look at how major trafficking organizations operate, what you find is that they function remarkably like legitimate multinational corporations, facing similar business challenges and solving them with similar strategies, just without legal protections or legitimate dispute resolution mechanisms. Understanding narco empires as businesses, rather than just criminal gangs, helps explain why they're so durable, why they adapt so quickly to enforcement pressure, and why simply arresting leaders rarely destroys the organizations. Let's start with brand and product positioning, because even in illegal markets, reputation matters enormously. When a trafficker is buying cocaine to distribute in their city, they're not just buying a commodity, they're buying from a supplier with a reputation. Is the product consistently high quality? Is this supplier reliable about delivery times? If there's a problem, can it be resolved without violence? The most successful trafficking organizations build reputations for reliability and quality that become almost brand-like. Cocaine from certain Colombian producers is known to be very pure. Product from certain Mexican cartels is known to arrive consistently. This reputation is valuable. It's cultivated deliberately, and it's defended aggressively because it's what allows organizations to charge premium prices and maintain customer loyalty. Supply chain management is probably where the parallels to legitimate business are most obvious, because moving cocaine from Andean coca fields to consumer markets in North America or Europe requires coordinating dozens of steps and hundreds or thousands of people. There are farmers who need to be paid and sometimes coerced. There are laboratories that need chemists and chemicals and security. There are transporters using planes, boats, submarines, tunnels, hidden compartments in trucks, each method requiring specialized expertise and equipment. There are corrupt officials who need to be bribed at exactly the right times. There are distributors who break down bulk shipments into smaller amounts. There are money couriers moving cash proceeds back down the chain. Any breakdown in this supply chain costs enormous amounts of money and creates enormous risks. If a shipment gets seized, if a transporter gets arrested and talks to police, if a corrupt official suddenly decides to enforce the law, the entire operation can unravel. So the most successful organizations invest heavily in redundancy and compartmentalization. They run multiple routes simultaneously, so losing one doesn't shut down everything. They keep different parts of the operation isolated so that people arrested at one stage can't compromise other stages. They develop sophisticated communication systems, encrypted phones, coded language, sometimes reverting to human couriers to avoid electronic surveillance. Diversification is another key strategy borrowed directly from legitimate business. The major Mexican cartels learned that depending entirely on cocaine creates vulnerabilities. What if Colombian production drops? What if a major route gets shut down? What if consumer preferences shift? So they diversified aggressively. Methamphetamine production and trafficking became huge because meth can be produced anywhere with relatively simple chemicals, eliminating dependence on agricultural products from specific regions. Fentanyl became attractive for similar reasons. It's synthetic, incredibly potent, and can be manufactured in urban laboratories without needing coca fields or poppy fields. But cartels diversified beyond just other drugs. They moved into human smuggling, which uses similar routes and infrastructure as drug trafficking, but with different risk profiles and profit margins. They expanded into extortion, taxing legitimate and illegitimate businesses in their territories. They got involved in fuel theft, tapping pipelines, and selling stolen gasoline. They moved into illegal mining and logging. Some organizations essentially became organized crime conglomerates, generating revenue from half a dozen different criminal enterprises, which makes them much more resilient than single product operations. Money laundering presents unique challenges at the scale these organizations operate, because we're not talking about thousands of dollars. We're talking about billions that need to be moved, hidden, and eventually integrated into legitimate financial systems where it can be used openly. The basic problem is simple. If you're making billions of dollars in cash from illegal drug sales, you can't just walk into a bank and deposit it without raising immediate red flags. You need systems to make that money appear legitimate. Real estate is a classic method because property values can be manipulated, Purchases can be made through shell companies that obscure the real buyer. And once you own property, you can sell it later for legitimate money. Cash-intensive businesses like car washes, laundromats, restaurants, and nightclubs work well because you can claim more cash revenue than you actually earned and mix illegal money with legitimate receipts. Shell companies and offshore banking allow money to pass through multiple jurisdictions, creating layers that make it almost impossible for investigators to trace back to criminal origins. Trade-based money laundering exploits international commerce by over-invoicing or under-invoicing imports and exports to move value across borders in ways that look like legitimate trade. The Colombian black market, peso exchange, was for decades one of the most sophisticated money laundering systems ever created. Using Colombian businessmen's need for dollars and drug traffickers' need to convert dollars into pesos to create a system that moved billions annually without money ever physically crossing borders. But perhaps the most important business function for narco empires is managing corruption, and this is where they operate most like states rather than corporations. The amount of money spent on bribing officials at every level, police, military, customs agents, judges, politicians, prison guards, is staggering, but it's also absolutely essential. A trafficker who tries to save money by not paying bribes properly will get arrested and their operation will get shut down. A trafficker who invests properly in corruption can operate almost openly in some regions because the officials who should be stopping them are on the payroll. The sophistication of some corruption schemes is remarkable. Cartels maintain intelligence files on officials, tracking their families, their finances, their vulnerabilities. They identify who can be bribed and who has to be threatened or killed. They sometimes place their own people into government positions through legitimate hiring processes, so they have assets inside institutions. They've compromised entire police forces, military units, and local governments in ways that make meaningful law enforcement almost impossible in certain regions. This is how you run a shadow multinational, how you generate and move billions of dollars through illegal markets while competing with rivals and evading law enforcement from multiple countries. These aren't just street gangs or random criminals. These are sophisticated organizations running what amount to multinational corporations that happen to be in prohibited markets. And that's exactly why they're so hard to defeat. Because the business fundamentals are sound, because demand for their product is enormous and consistent, and because prohibition creates profit margins that make any risk seem worthwhile. We've talked a lot about the business, the money, the organizations. Now we need to talk about what this system actually costs, because the human toll of the cocaine trade is measured in hundreds of thousands of lives destroyed, communities traumatized, states corrupted, and a war on drugs that has lasted over 50 years without achieving its stated goals, while creating enormous collateral damage. Start in Colombia, where decades of cocaine-related conflict have killed enormous numbers of people. The violence isn't just cartel members fighting each other or police. It's car bombs that kill civilians. It's assassinations of judges and journalists and politicians. It's entire communities displaced by fighting between traffickers and government forces. The FARC guerrillas, who began as ideological revolutionaries, became so deeply involved in the cocaine trade that they essentially became a narco-terrorist organization, kidnapping and killing to protect their coca territories and taxation schemes. Right-wing paramilitaries, formed initially to fight the guerrillas also got involved in trafficking, and the lines between political violence and drug violence became impossible to distinguish. Colombia has made remarkable progress in reducing violence and weakening trafficking organizations over the past 2 decades. But the cost was enormous. Thousands of police and military killed, billions of dollars in aid from the United States, a peace agreement with FARC that remains controversial and incomplete. And coca cultivation in Colombia is actually higher now than it was at the peak of the Medellín and Cali cartels, which suggests that all the violence and enforcement may have changed who controls the trade, but didn't significantly reduce it. Move to Mexico, and the picture is even worse in some ways. Conservative estimates suggest over 300,000 people killed in cartel-related violence since 2006, when then-President Calderón launched a military offensive against the cartels. Tens of thousands more have disappeared, and mass graves are still being discovered regularly. Entire regions are too dangerous for normal economic activity or governance. Journalists who investigate cartel activities are murdered so frequently that self-censorship is widespread. Local officials are sometimes given a choice: accept bribes or die. Some towns have lost their entire police force, either killed or fled. The human cost extends to ordinary people caught in the middle, families extorted, migrants kidnapped while crossing Mexico on their way to the United States, young people recruited into cartels because there are no legal employment opportunities, communities that live under the constant threat of violence they can't control and can't escape. The social fabric in some regions has been shredded by decades of this conflict. Central America shows similar patterns as trafficking routes pass through countries like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador that have weak governance and limited resources to combat powerful criminal organizations. Gang violence, much of it related to drug trafficking, has created murder rates that are among the highest in the world. Migration flows from Central America to the United States are driven partly by people fleeing violence that's directly connected to the cocaine trade. But the human cost isn't only in producing and transit countries. It's also in the consumer countries where cocaine addiction destroys lives. About 25 million people worldwide use cocaine, and while not all users become severely addicted, cocaine dependence is devastating for those who develop it. Relationships destroyed, careers ruined, financial collapse, health problems including heart attacks and strokes, psychiatric problems including paranoia and psychosis. Emergency rooms deal with cocaine overdoses and cocaine-related violence. Communities deal with cocaine-related crime and social problems. And here's the uncomfortable truth that decades of the war on drugs have demonstrated. Enforcement-focused strategies don't work the way policymakers claim they will. Arresting leaders doesn't destroy organizations. It creates power vacuums that lead to more violence as rivals fight to fill them. Eradicating coca fields in one region just shifts cultivation to another region or another country. The balloon effect, where squeezing one area makes the problem pop up elsewhere. Interdicting shipments might stop that particular load, but doesn't significantly reduce overall supply, because profit margins are so high that traffickers can afford to lose substantial percentages of shipments and still make enormous money. Prohibition itself is arguably the fundamental problem because it creates the profit margins that make violent trafficking organizations economically viable. Legal cocaine for pharmaceutical use costs almost nothing to produce. Illegal cocaine for recreational use costs enormous amounts because of legal risks, which means enormous profits for anyone willing to take those risks. That profit funds the violence, the corruption, the sophisticated infrastructure. Some economists and drug policy experts argue that the only way to really undermine narco empires is to eliminate the prohibition that makes them profitable. But that's politically difficult in most countries and raises legitimate concerns about increased addiction. Meanwhile, the cocaine trade is at record levels. That's not speculation. That's the data from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, showing that production and consumption are both higher now than they were at the supposed peak of the Colombian cartels. Over 3,700 tons produced annually, 25 million users worldwide, up significantly from a decade ago. Seizures are at record levels, which is sometimes presented as an enforcement success. But seizures being at record levels while the market is also at record levels suggests that enforcement is capturing a fairly consistent percentage while the overall trade expands. And there's a next wave coming that makes the cocaine problem look almost manageable by comparison. Synthetic opioids, particularly fentanyl, are now the leading cause of overdose deaths in the United States because fentanyl is incredibly potent, relatively easy to manufacture, and enormously profitable. Mexican cartels that built their empires on cocaine are pivoting heavily toward fentanyl because the economics are even better. You can manufacture it near consumer markets rather than depending on agricultural products from South America. The potency means you can ship much smaller amounts for the same number of doses, and demand from opioid-addicted users is intense. Methamphetamine production and trafficking are also growing, again because meth is synthetic and can be produced almost anywhere with relatively accessible chemicals. The diversification of trafficking organizations into synthetics makes them less vulnerable to agricultural eradication and potentially more dangerous because synthetics can be far more potent and unpredictable than plant-based drugs. So where does this leave us? The age of the big cartels, the Medellíns and Calis that once dominated the cocaine trade, may be over in the sense that no single organization controls anywhere near the percentage of the market those groups once did. But the market they created is bigger than ever, more global, more sophisticated, generating more money and causing more harm across more countries than at any point in history. The empires have fallen, but the empire building continues, just more fragmented and harder to see clearly. The line on the table that started this story connects impoverished farmers to billion-dollar criminal enterprises, to corrupted states, to users in nightclubs who often have no idea of the journey their drug took to reach them. That system has proven remarkably resistant to every strategy tried against it, adapting and evolving faster than policy can respond. And until we're willing to honestly confront why prohibition creates these problems rather than solves them, until we're willing to think differently about drug policy in ways that prioritize harm reduction over punishment, the empires will keep rising and falling while the human cost keeps climbing. This story started with a sacred leaf in the Andes and ends with the most profitable illegal commodity in human history, with empires built on white powder, with violence that has killed hundreds of thousands and corrupted entire states. Cocaine transformed from medicine to curse to business, and that business has shaped the modern world in ways we're still trying to understand. If this deep dive helped you understand how dark economies function, how prohibition creates the very problems it claims to solve, how markets can become more powerful than governments, I'd really appreciate if you subscribed. There are more stories like this, more hidden systems, more shadow economies, more moments where policy and reality collide with consequences that echo for generations. Thanks for being here. Thanks for engaging with difficult histories that don't have simple answers. See you in the next one.